Hello and welcome to the first of the new 2023 syllabus revision videos. This is Level 4 Diploma in Procurement and Supply, and it's Level 4 Module 1, Scope and Influence in Procurement and Supply. We're starting on learning outcome number 1, which is to understand and analyse the added value that can be achieved through procurement and supply chain management. So there are 4 learning outcomes for this particular module. We're focusing on learning outcome 1 now, which is to understand and analyse the added value that can be achieved through procurement and supply. And that is broken down into 4 sub-learning outcomes. The first one being to compare the concepts of procurement and supply chain management. We're then going to look at the different sources of added value in procurement and supply, and then describe the categories of spend that an organisation may purchase, finishing off with differentiating the stakeholders of procurement and supply chain functions. So in 1.1, the concepts of procurement and supply, this gets broken down even further into the definitions of procurement and supply chain, the supply chain management and networks. It compares the roles and functions of supply chain management within procurement. And then we look at definitions of and the function of supply chain tiering, issues relating to complex supply chains, logistics and materials management, and waste management and closed loop recycling. So on the 1.1.1, the definitions, we're going to start by looking at some key definitions. So procurement involves something that's tangible or intangible. And as you can see on the screen, something tangible is usually goods, they're physical assets that can be handled, stored, resold, etc. Whereas intangible things generally are services. You can benefit from them, like education, software, but you can't have anything tangible to keep at the end of it. The process of procurement begins by identifying a need, and it's completed once the goods and services that meet that need are delivered. So procurement is a strategic function of a business. You need a high level of skill to do procurement. It takes place in almost every organisation, because you think about it, every business needs things. So if they need sourcing things and buying things, unfortunately, that's going to involve procurement. Some organisations have large procurement teams, whereas others just use a handful of people to acquire those needs. But regardless of that, there's always going to be a cost associated with procurement. Now, added value is the addition of a feature or capability for which a buyer is prepared to pay extra. So in monetary and general business sense, it takes into account all the costs that contribute towards making that product and service. And added value in procurement can be in a variety of ways. Cost is the amount that has to be paid or spent to buy or obtain something. Inventory exists of raw materials, work in progress, and finished products. Logistics is the commercial activity of transporting goods to customers. And purchasing is an action of acquiring goods for the buying organisation. Quality is a standard of something that we measure against other things of a similar kind. And supply refers to the movement of materials through channels to the end user. So I guess you can kind of describe supply as an infrastructure, which ensures that products and services get from the supplier to the customer. And the final definition is waste management. These are all the activities and actions that require or that you need to kind of use to manage waste from its inception to its disposal, and that can include process, not just products itself. Now, a typical supply chain begins with the sourcing and extraction of raw materials from the primary sector. So there are 3 kind of sectors, I suppose, in industrial sectors. Your primary sector looks at the raw materials, which is at the bottom. So you've got agriculture, forestry, mining, and fisheries. A lot of those raw materials are then used by the secondary sector. So they're used in manufacturing, they're used in construction, and they use those raw materials to refine and process them into a finished product. And then the final one is the tertiary sector, which is largest. It's about 70% of our economy sits in the tertiary sector. And this is where the finished products are then sold on to the customer. So it could be trades, banks, retailers, education, leisure, etc. So the idea of a supply chain is kind of a useful way of describing the staged interactions between a number of suppliers who will, by working together, create value for customers. In any chain of suppliers, there are both buyers and suppliers. Buyers take delivery of goods or services, and in turn, they pay for goods and then add further value to these before supplying them to the next customer along the chain. So using the supply chain idea, we can easily understand that there is efficiencies of supply chains that are based on the quality of the relationship between a buyer and a supplier in that chain. And as procurement experts, it's part of our job to ensure these relationships add as much value as is possible. So the chain idea is also useful in considering the backward flow of waste and faulty goods. So that's when it comes back from the consumer to the manufacturer. And the process of moving goods back through the supply chain is called backhauling or reverse logistics. It's quite commonplace nowadays. Think about sort of returning something that you bought online. And the other definitions I just wanted to finish on this slide is the upstream and the downstream. So you will be a buyer somewhere in that chain. You'll have suppliers behind you, which is your upstream, but also customers in front of you. But that might not be the final customer. It could get passed on many times until it reaches the consumer. So anything in front of you in your supply chain is your downstream. So the modern concept of supply chain management, or SCM, derives from the shipyards of Japan in the early 50s. And it was subsequently delivered and developed further by the car manufacturing industry, in particular Toyota. So one of the enduring outcomes of Toyota's manufacturing processes was just in time, JIT. So supply chain management systems was when organizations became increasingly aware of the costs of sitting on warehouses that are full of stock. And prior to just in time, companies would hold large quantities of components to be used as and when required in the production process. But nowadays, it's more common for companies to try and manage the supply chains and only order the inputs that they need rather than having warehouses full of stock. But that's not a simple task, because as more and more organizations are tasked with managing supplies and production on an international scale, this has just become a much bigger problem. So many organizations now have as much as 80% of their turnover comprising of bought-in goods and services. And owing to these complexities, there are issues in the supply chain management, and they're of great importance to organizations because supply chain managers have a vital role to play in managing costs. So I think a lot of people now describe supply chain management as the latest procurement and logistics philosophy that needs to be adopted. Now, if we expand a supply chain into a supply chain network, it's an evolution of that basic supply chain. And a lot of this has happened due to rapid technology advancements. So you've got kind of basic supply chains developed into much more complex structures. So the idea of the supply chain is kind of helpful. It helps us think about the concept of the interrelatedness of our relationships within and external to the organization. But this is sometimes a little bit too simplistic for the real complexities of the relationships, because in reality, the relationships are highly interactive and complex. So therefore, the idea of a network is a little bit more appropriate. It gives more of a strategic model for mapping and analysing, plus it expands the promotion of a wide range of collaborations on offer. So it's kind of a suggesting that there's an idea of an extended enterprise and even virtual organizations. So your network, as I say, it's an extension of your supply chain. It includes other parties in the process. So if you can see on this diagram, you can see things like transport, finance, marketing, IT potentially sometimes you see in this particular diagram too. So you've got your upstream and your downstream, left and right. But you're going to need these complementary services, like say the bank help you with the transferring of the money backwards and forwards. Transport would link it from A to B, B to C. And IT nowadays, transmitting volumes, orders, forecasts, all that sort of stuff kind of sits in that much wider supply chain network. So you've got to think about it as sort of two-way flows. You've got the physical movement of goods going from left to right, and then you've got money flowing from the right to the left. So money has to be passed back up the chain, as well as information flows go in the same direction. I guess the information probably flows in two ways, but ultimately it's the demand. The retailers won't know what to buy if they haven't got sort of demand coming from the customer. So where does procurement kind of fit in? So as we know, procurement is the process of getting the goods your company needs or the services, whereas supply chain management is the extensive infrastructure that's needed to get those goods. So your supply chain management should ultimately be concerned with one of many responsibilities that are faced by the procurement function. So you can see how sort of procurement, is looking at suppliers and the inputs for raw materials, manufacturing then take over, and then sales take over. But supply chain management will see the entire process from start to finish. So some of the tasks involved in procurement might include developing quality standards, financing the purchases, creating orders, negotiating prices, buying the goods, managing the inventory, even disposal of the waste sometimes, like the packaging. But in the overall supply chain process, procurement stops once your company has possession of the goods. But supply chain management thinks about everybody that then gets that product into the hands of the customer. So yeah, you take the raw materials, it gets manufactured, it gets transported, you've got warehouses and staff, but all the other tasks and functions that contribute towards moving that product. So we've got a couple of examples here about supply chain tiering. So the first one is a traditional model where top-level purchasers seek to add most value in the supply chain by undertaking the manufacturing of some products. The supplier needs to manage the relationships associated with, or the buyer, should I say, needs to manage the relationships with 6 suppliers, supplier A to F at the top. And it is acceptable in some organisations, but as the number of suppliers starts to grow, there may be a need to consider tiering the supply chain arrangements. So it's a kind of way of, managing your supply base. So your suppliers are kind of organised, and in a way that your first tier suppliers deal directly with the buying organisation. And then the second tier suppliers will participate in the same chain, but they report to the first tier supplier, who essentially consolidate everything and then pass it on to the buying organisation. So in this example, it's supplier X and Y in the second diagram. So this practice originated by the automotive industry. And what it did was it allowed car assemblies to reduce their first tier supply chain to well below 1,000 suppliers. And that practice allows for the development of differentiated relationships with a smaller community of suppliers. Now, the traditional model where the top-level purchaser seeks to add the most value is, I think, probably a little bit outdated. I mean, I'm not to say it wouldn't be relevant to smaller organisations, but the larger you get, I think the tiering arrangement becomes a little bit more complex. So what you're seeing on this diagram is the OEM at the top. The OEM stands for the original equipment manufacturer. And then they've got their tier ones. Tier ones then buy from tier twos, and tier twos potentially buy from tier threes. So this can become a real complicated supply chain network, and traceability of where things come from can be quite a challenge for organisations. Some are involving putting a lot of this information on a sort of electronic system to aid that traceability, but it can become quite complicated. So it's just really an illustration of the fact that supply chains aren't that traditional straight line that we all kind of think about. It can become incredibly complicated. I think this gets even worse when you expand globally. Production lead times then become longer as products continue to diversify. And as a result, there's a need to improve our supply chain operational speed and accuracy. So the complexity reflects the need for visibility in order to optimize one's supply chain performance. I think what you can see here is there's not necessarily a straight line again. You've got raw material suppliers supplying to several different semi-finished product suppliers who then supply to different manufacturers and so on. So what this diagram shows you is how logistics kind of is an all-encompassing theme. And, logistics was a term that started to become quite trendy in the early 2000s, which was previously referred to as materials management, which is upstream, and physical distribution management, which is downstream. So I think a lot of supply chains and their management was going to be concerned with the downstream, the demand, and dealing with the supplies in the upstream. But there is also the action of distributing the goods to the customer. So this creates an additional requirement in managing supply chains. So logistics is kind of concerned with moving and handling the goods involved in the supply chain, regardless if you're bringing it in your upstream or pushing it out through your downstream. So logistics management is a supply chain management component that is used to meet customer needs through the planning, control, and implementation of the effective movement of storage or related information, as well as the goods and services from origin all the way through to destinations. Some sort of say, movement and handling and storage of goods, or potentially the planning, implementing, and controlling procedures for the efficient and effective transportation and storage of goods. But it isn't just goods. Sometimes it includes services and related information from the point of origin to the point of consumption. It's so important. If any of you can remember when KFC ran out of chicken, this will kind of show you the importance of why you need supply chain management and logistics management. So in terms of logistics and materials management, you've got, from an internal perspective, you've got the extraction, production, manufacturing, warehousing and storage, but you're also dealing with some external distribution, transport and retail. So external logistics is especially concerned with things that don't move between your suppliers, but I suppose it's about thinking about your distribution centers and your customers. Whereas internal logistics has similar goals, but the things that are tracked are usually moving within a virtual four walls or your organization. Demand planning is knowing what is required and when. Fleet management is a solution to physically transport goods from one place to another. You've then got inventory management, managing how much inventory you've got in place. Material management, which is the warehouse handling and storage, as well as the inspection and issuing of any raw materials and components. And that's kind of linked to order fulfillment. But material management is a planning and control of functions that support the complete flow of materials and associated flow of information. And these functions include identification, cataloging, standardization, there's a needs determination, scheduling, inspection, quality control, even packing, storage, inventory control and distribution through to disposal. So a key element to that is about trying to reduce waste. So reducing waste will not only protect the environment, but will also save on costs and reduce the expenses of disposal. In the same way, recycling and or reusing the waste that is produced benefits the environment by lessening the need to extract resources and lower the potential for contamination. Waste laws are generally designed to minimise or eliminate the uncontrolled dispersal of waste materials into the environment in a manner that kind of may cause ecological or biological harm. And it'll include laws that are designed to reduce the generation of waste and promote or mandate. So waste management is the process of dealing with byproducts and unwanted outputs from your production process. It may be in the form of solid materials or gaseous or liquid outputs. It can also include heat. It could include data, or surplus redundant human resources that form part of the waste management through process. But if we just think about solid waste for a second, you're looking at the waste hierarchy on the screen. And the waste hierarchy essentially looks to try and reduce, reuse, recycle, recover, repair. There's loads of like R words that kind of prevent it basically from going to landfill, which is where it will end up rotting. And all of that's going to require quite a lot of teamwork to reduce, the data collection time and everything else. And there are a number of laws and regulations regarding waste management. You've got the Environmental Protection Act, which deals with issues relating to waste on land. So it places a duty on local authorities to collect waste. And as a business, you've got a duty to ensure that any waste your company produces is handled safely and within the law. You've got the Landfill Directive, which aims to reduce reliance on landfill as a disposal option. So trying to decrease environmental impacts of landfill and the risks to human health whilst imposing a consistent minimum standard. You then got the hazardous waste regulations that came into force and were produced not only as part of the framework of the controlled management of hazardous waste, but it replaces the special waste regulations. You've got packaging waste regulations to meet requirements of the European Directive on packaging. And with that aim, it's not only to increase the recovery and recycling of packaging, but it's about reducing the amount of packaging you use altogether. You've got the UK waste regulations, which requires businesses to separate recyclable materials like paper and plastic and glass from other waste. And this amendment was from the EU Waste Framework Directive to ensure that improvements to the quality and quantity of recycling happened across the United Kingdom. So closed loop recycling is sort of the way forward, I guess, because it's a way by which products or materials can then be used and turned into new products or converted back to raw materials indefinitely without, losing its properties during the process. So identify products in day-to-day life that go through a recycling journey. Take paper. There is issues associated with recycling, but equally, what value does it generate? And how can we build this into our procurement activities? So the closed loop recycling is often embedded in law to improve the recycling and raw material recovery by, I suppose, returning spent products back to the manufacturer for reprocessing. And that could include durables like batteries or old equipment, as well as cut-offs or manufacturing excess. So a good example of closed loop recycling is with battery production or any products under the Battery Directive, which demands all old battery waste to be sent back to the manufacturer to preserve the raw material. You've then got the WEEE Directive, which addresses waste of electronic and electrical equipment. Again, this ensures raw material recovery. So it's just about, never putting it in landfill, basically. So moving on to 1.2, we're going to look at now the 5 rights. We're going to look at total life costs or whole life costs and asset management. How we achieve the 5 rights from external suppliers, as well as the added value, innovation and sustainability, which is in addition to the 5 rights, and defining value for money. So 5 rights should always be considered when you're making a purchase. So you need the right price, which covers factors that affect this. I mean, quality and quantities and urgency are all going to affect the price, but it ultimately needs to be fair and reasonable and competitive. You've got the right quality, which looks at quality standards plus the cost implications of quality that are too high or too low. Quantity looks at the the volumes, and it refers to economies of scale, your inventory approaches and levels at the right time. For example, during warehouse opening hours, during the day. So I guess, procurement objectives, is normally set against these 5 rights. And over the years, this approach has been, highly successful, but the role of procurement develops. So does the interpretation of the 5 rights. So quality traditionally refers to quality of the product or service. Quantity always dictated that the buyer should buy the right amount, not too much, not too little. Price, of course, important, but we are taught to aim for a competitive price. And it usually refers to goods and services being delivered as well to the right place, or the last mile, a term used by supply chain management and transport planning to describe the movement of goods and services from a transport hub to the final destination. And what we've got to remember about time is that time waits for no man. And we no longer wait to consider the time of delivery as the only aspect of time that needs to be considered. And of course, to the right place, meaning the correct delivery address. So just looking a little bit deeper into some of these, if we talk about quantity, we always dictate to the buyer that you should buy just the right amount, not too much, not too little, because there is a cost to inventory. And it's all the costs of the stock being held by an organisation that is not necessarily needed at the current time. All organisations will have to keep some inventory, but in an ideal world, we need to try and keep this as low as possible because of all the associated costs. So two ways that we can do that might be to use Kanban or just in time. Just in time is a system that works alongside lean manufacturing. And it's all about reducing waste in the supply chain, making sure stock is not held unnecessarily. Whereas Kanban is a production method where instructions are sent from one operation to the next. Essentially, it's a bin system. So you have a bin with your maximum stock holding. Bin 2 has got your buffer stock, which has enough stock in there to get you over your lead time. So if your reorder takes 2 weeks from the point of your order, then you need 2 weeks worth of stock in bin 2, and it will get to a point where it triggers a reorder. Quality standards exist for an organisation to produce and supply goods and services that are free from defects, acceptable. We use standards and processes and procedures to achieve the quality standards. And collectively, this is known as quality management systems. And that has a quality assurance prevention method, which focuses on process, but it also has a quality control, which is after the product or service has been delivered, and that's concerned with detecting defects. So it's looking at the product or service rather than the process, and they have to work together. And the most recognised standard for this is the ISO 9001. It is the only global standard for quality that is recognised worldwide, and that standard is based on continuous improvement, risk management, leadership, process, supply chain, and efficiency. Another thing about quality is about the specification. Now, I always say that, your spec is the heart of the contract. There are two types. We know as outcome-based conformance and technical input-based ones the input ones are conformance, the output-based ones are performance specs. So let's start with the performance ones. This will outline what the product or service is to do or achieve. It allows for a bit of innovation and looking at various options on that requirement to be considered. And that promotes a lot more competition in the marketplace. Some people refer to them as output or outcome specifications, and they're often used, as I said, in services like facilities management, cleaning. We're not going to tell somebody how to do it, we're just going to tell them what we want them to achieve. So if you have a performance spec, the buyer will describe what the expected outcome should be in terms of functions or performance. It's really down to the supplier then to furnish that and satisfy that requirement. They're much easier and cheaper to draft compared to the more prescriptive conformance specs. And the success of the specification doesn't necessarily depend on the technical knowledge of the buyer. Suppliers may well know better than us on how to do that satisfactorily. That gives a greater share of responsibility to the supplier. If the supplier doesn't perform against the outcome or the output, then that's where we need to redress it. But if they do achieve the output, we shouldn't really be concerned with how they achieved it. Conformance specs, conversely, will detail exactly what the product or service will be made of, like a recipe or a chemical formula or a brand name, a part number. So responses to a conformance spec should have identical offerings. The buyer details exactly what is required and what the product must consist of. It could even be an engineering drawing, a blueprint, a sample. The supplier may not know the detail or even at all what function that product will play. All the buyer is kind of asking the supplier to do is conform to the description that they've given. So you can have like a technical or a design spec and a functional spec. It's really important that you distinguish clearly between these. So if in your conformance spec, the buyer bears the risk of the design not performing to the expectations, because all the supplier is going to do is conform to the letter, of the descriptions to safeguard in the law, if the product doesn't conform or doesn't, reach its intended function, then it's the buyer's responsibility rather than the supplier. If the spec is limited, if it's vague, if it's inaccurate, if it's incomplete, then the work may conform to the specification, but not necessarily be the right quality or fit for purpose. And the prescriptive nature of the specification can restrict innovation. So this is a particular problem if the spec details means that, the product supplied isn't correct and the buyer potentially closes itself off from manufacturing developments of which it may be unaware. So here's just a couple of examples. So conformance specs, you've got drawings, formulas, brands, samples, standards, inputs, whereas performance ones are more around functions, capabilities, inputs, health and safety levels, SLAs, KPIs, and so on. What about the consequences then if the needs are not delivered on time? Orders must be placed on time and delivered on time. So the consequences are you could have a stock out, which would end up meaning your production stops, you lose sales, potentially additional costs to replace the goods, paying overtime, penalties for waiting, and even the relationships could be affected, especially when customers' needs are unfulfilled. So now we need to look at the failures to deliver to the correct place, because orders must be delivered to the right place, and any failure to do so could result in stockouts, which means you've got no stock to meet your customer demand. Then unhappy customers who very well may take their business elsewhere, or you might find that you're going to have to offer them discounts to keep them. And then additional costs associated with delivering to the wrong address or any redirections. So now we look at price, and there's several ways that we can look at price. Firstly, let's look at a price and what is the right price for a seller. This is a price that the market will bear, a price that allows the seller to win business in competition with others, and a price which allows the seller to cover the costs and ideally to make a healthy profit. But what is the right price for the buyer? It's a price they can afford, a price that reflects sound procurement practices, a price that gives the buyer a cost of quality advantage, and a price that appears fair or represents value for money. So if you think about the ways in which we will look at price, sometimes we do that in the sourcing process, which is a pre-contract activity. It's concerned with the how and where the goods or services are going to be obtained. We have to develop suppliers, select suppliers, and that sourcing can be tactical, which is short term, low level, or strategic, which is high level and longer term. The second way is to look at it from an aggregation of spend perspective, so combining orders of similar or same values from different departments in order to, get better buying power. And we can obtain price comparisons as well by issuing requests for quotes to the market, but taking care to ensure that comparisons can be made on a like-for-like basis, and also paying attention to different currencies if quotes are being sought from suppliers in different countries. And also check that your prices, check the gross versus the net. So does it include or exclude VAT? We can negotiate, whilst, price is obviously an important factor, we can negotiate on things like payment terms, length of contract, the warranties, the volume discounts, the risk share. But lastly, we need to think about Incoterms. So there are 4 groups of Incoterms. So when you're comparing the quotes that come back, you need to check whether they are all on the same delivery basis. So you've got your E's, your F's, your C's, and your D's. So the E's need to be collected from where the buyer, by the buyer from the seller's premises. So essentially the buyer bears all the costs and responsibilities throughout the entire journey. As you can see from this diagram, there's only one that starts with the letter E, and that is Ex Works. And the blue line shows the buyer's costs are everything from the point of picking it up from the seller's premises. The complete opposite to that are the Ds. So you've got your DDP. That's where the seller bears all the costs, which is why you've got the orange line going all the way from left to the buyer's premises. And its duties paid and everything else included. You could deliver at a place unloaded. So that leaves us with the Fs and the Cs. And what separates Fs from Cs is the deep blue sea. So the Fs will only go as far as where they're leaving from, so whatever country they're leaving from. If we look at the waterway ones at the bottom, they're the easiest to describe. So you've got FAS, which is free alongside the ship at the loading port, or free on board the ship. So the seller will just get it that little bit further and actually get it on board the boat. But from there onwards, the buyer has to pay all of the costs. And there's FCA, which is any mode of transport. It's usually kind of air freight and things like that. But what tends to happen is the buyer will present the seller with a label to attach to the goods, and all the seller has to do is take it to the carrier. So let's say they've decided they want you to send it by FedEx or UPS or something like that. The seller would have to get it to the FedEx or UPS drop-off point, but the seller doesn't pay after that point. And then the Cs go over the sea. So the seller has to get it to the port of arrival, so the country that it's going to. And again, if we look at the waterway ones at the bottom, you've got cost and freight only, or cost, insurance and freight. So the only difference between the two is whether the seller pays for insurance or not. If the buyer already has insurance or wants to pay for the insurance themselves, they'll do cost and freight only. But as soon as it gets to the port of arrival, the buyer has to go and collect it and bears all the costs thereafter, which does include things like customs clearances and everything else. And yeah, you've got a couple of other Cs that are any mode, usually, going across the air or perhaps driving from, one country or continent to the next. So similar concept, but it's carriage paid to and carriage and insurance paid to. Next bit is total cost of ownership, total cost of acquisition, life cycle costing and whole life costing. These all sound incredibly similar, so I just want to talk about what they are and how they're different. So total cost of acquisition is all the activities and costs associated with the procurement of goods, but it doesn't include the running costs. TCO is all costs from planning, tendering, procurement, contract management, and the disposal or termination of an asset. Life cycle costing is traditionally used in the construction and building industry. So it thinks about all the costs from constructing, operating, building a large asset, like the building and machinery, but it rarely includes the disposal because I guess it's not expecting the building to be demolished at a later date. And whole life costing essentially it's looking at assets more than anything really, because it's going to look at things like the financing, the acquisition of land potentially, any associated benefits from earnings derived from that asset over the life, and the disposal costs are seen at the very start of the project. So if we think about the process of buying a car, you've got several costs of potentially, first and foremost, the planning and preparing. So at this point, you're looking at the internet, you're looking at available cars, locations of dealers, and all the time you spend preparing. The second cost of acquiring and installing is you go into a car showroom, maybe negotiate a deal and potentially the payment arrangements with the dealer. The third cost of owning/financing the asset, you may have taken out a loan that attracts interest, and you must insure and tax the car as well. The fourth cost of operating and running, you'll have to put fuel in the car and service it on a regular basis and, replace anything that's worn due to wear and tear. And then at the end of the useful life of that car, you've got the cost of disposing or recycling it. And that's whether you decide to buy a new car, you might have to pay to repair it before you can sell it, or you might have to pay to have it taken away by a scrap dealer. And in whole life asset management, there is a total cost approach to this, such as detailing the specification and evaluation that should take into account all identifiable costs and attributes to the product and service from its acquisition through use, maintenance, end of life, such as recycling and disposal. So there's going to be direct costs. So examples of that could be scheduled maintenance and the energy used throughout the life of this particular forklift truck. But in the case of total cost of ownership, that will include less apparent external environmental costs, such as the cost of emissions or greenhouse gases based on the energy use of that forklift truck. But at the end, you've got that disposal or resale value, because sometimes, you swap your equipment out every 4 or 5 years, and it might actually have a little bit of value left. If it does, then obviously you can deduct any resale value from the whole life cost. So achieving the 5 rights of procurement from external suppliers, procurement departments can purchase products and services from both internal and external customers. Internals, are generally part of the same company, but they can be in a different function, division, or location. Whereas your externals are organisations that are completely separate from your buying organisation. And what we do to get those 5 rights is to use contracts, service level agreements, and KPIs to manage the external suppliers. So looking at the contract side just firstly, these are legal agreements that 2 parties or more have agreed to. It's legally binding, but it must have essential elements in order to conform in a court. So that's things like an offer, an acceptance, a consideration, intention, and capacity. Some contracts that are missing 1 or 2 of these essential elements will still hold up in court, but it's best to have all of those covered. So a contract differs to each specific requirement, but a short and simple contract may work well just for your needs, but it depends on the job. And at the very least, a contract should include the basics, like a description of the services or the goods, the payment and completion terms, and the dispute resolution clauses. So when you draw up a legally binding contract, it outlines what should happen when the 5 rights of procurement, the whens and the whys and what would happen to ensure that both the buyer and supplier have a similar and same understanding. So you can see the list of here of what's specified and how in that 3rd column, how it links to the 5 rights. Similarly with your KPIs, this sets obviously targets for the most important factors that should be achieved. And if you look in the middle between the qualitative and quantitative KPIs on the screen, you'll see the 5 right words again. You've got quality, time, quantity, place. And they're included in a contract, generally form part of the contractual agreement. And then the performance of the supplier is monitored against these KPIs just to assess if the supplier is meeting them. And as I said, they could be qualitative, which is based on subjective, factors like, customer satisfaction, number of rejects, whereas the quantitative ones are very hard numbers, facts and figures. They're very objective, like numbers of deliveries that are late, number of, issues we had, etc., percentages. So the ultimate benefit of key performance indicators is the ability to measure the result of your actions, which are often undertaken based on assumptions anyway. And whilst research can help you to make educated guesses and reduce your risk, it's really important to set the key performance indicators to help increase or stop activities that create better or worse than expected results. So identifying the vital indicators for your company's success is going to help you to establish accurate performance targets. So for example, the number of customers that you have may not be as important as the total revenue your sales generate. So measuring your company's success through achievable goals is an aid in analysing areas where your business excels and where it can be improved. But if you rely on only figures that represent total sales, revenue, or profits, you may not know whether or not you can do a better job and how you're able to grow your operation. So setting targets can have disadvantages to a company if you don't follow up on the progress. You must address if your indicators, are meeting your employee, company-wide, and in comparison to your competitors, and then review those to determine if you must adjust them based on any sort of external factors like the economy, any new products being released into the industry from innovation or anything like that. So the good side to it is, it will improve motivation, communication, and relationships by sharing those common goals. But the limitations to that is that, if suppliers are rushing to meet the quantitative KPIs, you might find a reduction in quality and teamwork because they're focusing on achieving their KPIs rather than the greater good and the common goal. So methods buyers can use to determine the right price would be benchmarking, and you can obviously do that through multiple requests for quotes and comparing apples with apples. We can negotiate and try and drive the costs down based on our benchmarking exercises. In some instances, we could insist on open book costing, so we might look for a detailed breakdown of how they arrived at a particular cost, and we could look at sort of volume discounts and economic order quantities, just requesting price breaks if larger volumes are ordered. So the next bit about, other sources other than the 5 rights, you've got other sources of added value. And added value is the equivalent of an increase in value that a business creates by undertaking, a production process. It's quite easy to sort of think of some examples of how a production process can add value, but it ultimately is the difference between the price of the finished product or service and the cost of the inputs to make it. So consider the example of like new cars rolling down the production line being assembled by robots. The final completed and shiny new car that comes off the production line has a value. That is a price that they will sell it at. And that is going to be more than the cost of the sum of the parts to assemble it. So value has been added, but exactly how much is determined by the price your customer pays. Alternatively, imagine a celebrity chef preparing a meal at his luxury restaurant in central London. Once the cooking is complete, the meal is served and is sold for an extortionately high price. Subsequently, more than the cost of buying the ingredients, the value has been added. Other things in procurement, we look at things like additional features, if they put like, a year's free insurance on it or a reversing camera. It could be buying specifically from a brand, a name that you're familiar with. It could be for convenience, so you pay a little bit more for that, buying a pint of milk from the corner shop. Having excellent service, so a sort of supplier that has got a lot of attention to detail and puts themselves in your shoes and goes above and beyond. It could be about market development, so finding new markets for products, or even reducing the input costs, so trying to lower the cost while keeping the sale price the same. Reputation is a source of added value because a good reputation, and let's say you're buying from a company of a good ethical value or good reputation, that is good. Could be innovation, so maybe working with suppliers who can discover new ways of producing things and protecting you from substitutions. And finally, sustainability. We're talking about financially, environmentally, and socially working with suppliers with really good CSR programs. But achieving value for money can be described as using public resources in a way that creates and maximizes value. The use of public resources is defined as, public sector capital, resource expenditure, stewardship of assets, and raising revenue. This means that value for money is considered at a national level rather than in terms of how it affects the local area. And it ensures that, the assessment focuses on the impact of the proposal of what is additional in terms of like increasing an overall public value. But in procurement, we're pursuing the lowest whole life cost, clearly defining relevant businesses and benefits and delivering on time. And we're trying to do that by preventing waste and fostering competition and transparency and accountability during the tender process, because they're really key to achieving value for money. But if we consider value for money through the entire procurement process, it might include investing upfront, giving advance notice, of undertaking, early market engagement, including the value for money objectives and outcomes in our contracts, evaluating it when we're, looking at bid submissions, and selecting an offer that demonstrates overall value for money. And that could be throughout the life of the contract. And you can see a load of elements here, these key areas from like exchange rates, environment factors, freight costs, maintenance, packaging, payment terms, where it's going to be delivered to in terms of a place, the price, but not ignoring the kind of quality, the quantities, the reputation, the time, and potentially certainly warranties in the case of assets. And a lot of them, as you can see, your 5 rights are sort of making an appearance again. So learning outcome 1.3 is looking at the categories of spend that we may purchase. So we'll look at a typical breakdown of costs represented by procurement of goods, services and works. Then we'll look at the difference between stock and non-stock, direct and indirect, capital and operational expenditure. We've got service procurements, utility procurements and commodities. So the following terms relate to organisational costs. We've got fixed and variable costs, which ultimately link to direct and indirects. So direct procurements, the sourcing and supply of the product or service is directly related to a specific job. So examples here will be the raw materials used to produce a product. So these procurements are integral to an organisation because without them, there is no finished product for the consumer. Examples from a construction organisation include the bricks, the cement, the timber and the labour. Indirects, though, the goods and services are bought that an organisation needs to continue functioning. They don't necessarily contribute to the bottom line and they don't necessarily go into that finished product. So examples could be wages of support staff, your rent, your mobile phone contracts. And although important to an organisation, they're often sourced from several different suppliers. So relationships can be very different from those of a direct and core procurement nature. So as you can see from the diagram at the bottom, I've said that the variable costs generally link to directs because they vary with volume. The variable cost increase and decrease depending on the volumes that you're going to make or sell to your customer. Whereas the indirects tend to be fixed. The salaries are fixed, the rent is fixed, the insurance is fixed. It doesn't change if your sales go up or down. And this is just showing you how it looks graphically. So if you take the fixed cost, the straight line going from left to right, if you make 0 volume, 0 units, you're obviously working at a loss. So the point where the fixed and variable cross over is almost your break-even point. So you sort of draw a dotted line, I guess, down. I don't know if I can show that with a pen. Just give me a second. So sort of from here down, that the number of units that you would need to make would determine your break-even point. Because let's say that's like, I don't know, 10,000 units. If you make less than that in a year, your company won't make a profit. But as soon as you get over that kind of area in between the fixed and variable costs here, that is pure profit. Okay. All right, so an organisation costs or expense is the cost incurred to run a company. And a business may incur a number of costs as it's forming or growing. And these are considered the cost of doing business. So for example, a company will require buildings, equipment, materials and utilities. If we look at that in a graph, you've got the cost of your economic measure, all the sum of all expenses paid to produce a product or purchase an investment or acquire a piece of equipment. So when using it to define production costs, it measures the fixed, variable and expenses associated with producing a product. This is a fundamental concept for a business executive because it allows them to track the combined cost of their operation, and it allows the individual to make pricing and revenue decisions based on whether total costs are increasing or decreasing. So interested individuals can dig into the total cost numbers to separate them into fixed costs and variable costs and adjust the operations accordingly to lower the overall cost of production. So as you can see, 60% of this is your raw materials or your directs. The next biggest pie is your utilities, so your gas, electricity and water. Then you've got capital purchases at 8%, so equipment, vehicles, machinery, that type of thing. And then you've got your vehicles and transport, potentially like outsourced services rather than purchasing them as capital assets. And you've got marketing, and then the rest are into very small diminishing returns. And that's why a lot of organisations will invest heavily on, direct buyers, because it's 60% of their overall cost. So we're now going to look at stock and non-stock procurement. So stock procurement is listed in your inventory. So it will include raw materials, components, and finished goods. So raw materials are extracted from their natural source by the primary sector. So you've got examples here of, coal, cotton, fish, oil, rubber, and wheat. Your components are from the secondary sector, so they're manufactured. Someone's taken raw materials and created a finished good. So things like light bulbs, nuts and bolts, etc. And then the finished goods are stocked by a retailer or a wholesaler to sell to a consumer. This all needs to be managed carefully in order to keep inventory as cost effective as possible. And efficient stock control can save organisations huge sums of money. Stock procurement means that goods are shipped to stock in periodical defined terms without any specific order for a customer. The important premise is that demand can be forecasted when finishing the production process. The goods will be stocked until the next order is received from the customer. And one way of applying stock procurement by the customer is to define the minimum stock levels. If the stock levels fall below that defined limit, the procurement process is initiated. This type of procurement offers high flexibility to the customer, but the costs tend to be a lot higher. So your non-stock procurement would not be stored within your organisation's inventory systems. They're either services or they're goods that, like stationery and things like that, that you would just keep to kind of, cleaning materials, that sort of thing. You just for your business as usual activities. There could be one-off things, capital purchases. They could be intangible, like telephone systems, internet connections, that type of thing. But it's just as important to get value for money when you're procuring non-stock products. And in terms of like the differences between goods and services, goods tend to be tangible, whereas services are intangible. Goods generally are repeat orders, services could be one-off. Goods have a lead time, whereas services can be immediately consumed. Goods are quantifiable in terms of specification, whereas services are more qualitative. Goods can be stored for later use and services stop once delivered. And goods tend to be direct, not always, and services tend to be indirect, but not always. So direct procurement is the sourcing of raw materials that are directly related to the end result. It might not be raw materials, it could be services. Like for me, when I teach, I will be a direct cost to any study centre I teach for, because if I'm not teaching, they don't pay me, but if I am teaching, they pay me. Now, indirects are goods that don't directly contribute to that bottom line or profit, so they don't form part of the finished product. And what you're looking at on the screen is a Kraujek matrix. We use this to assess the importance, but also the risk associated with any of those procurements, whether they're direct or indirect. And it describes how we manage the supply relationships. And I guess direct relationships are going to be more important, certainly more strategic, due to the importance and risk profile. But they will need to be managed by buyers who are responsible for them. Indirects, though, are, as we know, intangible and are likely to be sourced from leverage or routine suppliers. Relationships with these suppliers are not as strong as the strategic suppliers, but they may involve paying for the service rather than establishing a long-term relationship. The next two types of spend we're going to look at is CapEx versus OpEx. CapEx is capital expenditure, whereas OpEx is operational expenditure. So the capital ones is generally an asset that an organisation will use and will last for a long time, more than a year. We either pay as a lump sum or through a bank loan, and it's accounted for and depreciated over that period on their balance sheet. Higher in value, and this is the sort of procurement that could be postponed if it suits you to buy it later, if you're sort of a little strapped for cash this year. And it requires a business case to demonstrate what return on investment you'll get as a result of buying that capital purchase. But your operational stuff is ongoing, it's paid monthly or annually. You account for it in the current month or year, fairly low to medium value in comparison. And you would require that on an ongoing basis. So it's unlikely you would defer an operational expenditure item. And it's business as usual, so it doesn't require a business case. Now, we talk a lot about goods in SIPs. It's really easy, isn't it, to think about, let's buy some raw materials, let's convert them in a manufacturing process, let's sell them to a customer. And when we're procuring services, it can have some challenges because, you cannot precisely measure or describe it in the same way that you could with goods. They don't have a weight, they don't have a colour, they don't have a material or a composition. And while it might seem that, document the specification and requirements for services are akin to writing up a job description, the person delivering the services may never set foot in your offices or even meet you. They'll not have the opportunity to observe and learn, but still they have to perform the tasks and generate the outcomes that you need. So unless the services in question are covering specific hours of the day, the number of resources or hours required are likely to be associated with that desired outcome. So you're making the leap from that outcome to the headcount, let alone specific skills and qualifications that require a deep understanding of the service and the value that it offers to its business. So some of the characteristics of services is that firstly, it's intangible, so you can't, physically possess anything. There's an inseparability characteristic in that, you can't necessarily produce it en masse. You can't separate the service provider from the service itself. There's a perishability element, which means that you can't store it. So tends to be, time sensitive. You think about a train ticket that you've booked. If you don't get to the station on time, the train will leave without you. You can't store it and go on a later train, unless you bought an open ticket, of course. You've then got the variability. So service is very difficult to control, to standardize, and also measure. And you'll always need customer contact where, with goods, you can go and pick it up from the shelf and just take it to the till. Whereas with services, you have to have some contact with the service provider. Utility procurements mainly refers to any electricity, gas, water, or telecommunications, and use tends to be recorded on a metered basis, and then you charge afterwards. But supply is a continuous flow, but a charge may also be made for the connection as well. Some of those are kind of under a monopoly or an oligopoly. So a monopoly is where you've got one dominant company that you're forced to buy that product from because there's no alternative. Whereas an oligopoly might be where there's it's between 2 and 10 actually. So they tend to be sort of highly regulated industries for that reason. Commodity procurement tends to relate to the purchase of items with a clear market price, and it allows for hard and soft commodities to flow from source to user through an intermediary. So your hard commodities are extracted using the ground and have a finite supply. So if you think about it like metals, and you're drilling for oil, you're mining for coal or gold or whatever, whereas soft commodities are typically from plants. And so with a good land husbandry, they're from a sustainable and renewable source because they can just keep regrowing. So buyers will monitor the pricing of commodities and will try to obtain fixed price contracts and maybe even forecast prices which are available to view within the futures exchange. Commodity trading is where traders buy raw materials from producers around the world. And so the last learning outcome 1.4 is to differentiate the stakeholders of procurement. So we're going to define stakeholders, give some examples and how we might map them in our supply chain function. So a stakeholder is a group or an individual who can affect or is affected by the achievements of your organisation objectives. So all parties who will be affected or will affect your strategy. So these people, groups, or organisations could be internal or external. So if they're internal, they're people that directly are involved in your business, like your colleagues, that could generate a requisition. Or an external one could be someone that's got an interest in your business. It could be affected, but not necessarily directly linked to it. Like shareholders, they've obviously got a financial interest in your organisation, but they're external to you. So the number of stakeholders can vary greatly between one enterprise and another. But some of these questions can help you identify who might be your stakeholder. So who is affected directly or indirectly by our actions? Who has the power to influence the decisions? Who could be concerned if the project succeeds or fails? Who has a personal interest in that project or organisation? Who will benefit through success of the project? Who could help solve problems? Who sets the regulations that you have to adhere to? And who carries out the related actions? So the examples of the stakeholders in procurement could be either internal, connected, or external. So as I've said already, your internal stakeholders are entities within a business. So they're generally employees and managers, the board of directors or investors. Employees want to earn money and to stay employed. Owners are interested in maximising the profit for the business. And investors obviously are concerned in income from their investment. So you've got your owners, your directors, your managers, your workers. The connected ones are generally connected contractually to you. So they're generally your customers and suppliers, but might also include your banks and shareholders and people like that. Externals are entities which are not within the business itself, and there's no contractual or commercial relationship with you. So it's generally like regulators, the government, the local community, etc., etc. Pressure groups sometimes. So for a supply chain to function effectively, key stakeholders have to be managed appropriately. And the Mendelow's matrix, which is what you're seeing on the screen, is a stakeholder matrix that categorizes stakeholders based on their level of power and interest. And you'll be placed into one of the 4 categories, which determines how they're going to be managed and communicated with. So if you have both high power and high importance, you're going to be managed closely. So that means you're very important. You're going to be, working on a regular basis with them. High power, low importance would be a keep satisfied type stakeholder. So this type of stakeholder, you would need to make sure that, let's say they're giving you a profit margin or something to work towards, you have to make sure you're satisfying that need. If it's a regulator, we have to make sure we satisfy them. Down the lower end of the power scale, you've got low, which is they put on here monitor, but some call it kind of minimal effort. So it's the lowest priority as they've not got any influence and are not a key stakeholder. But that's not to say you should ignore them. It's just, just talk to them on an ad hoc basis. You don't necessarily need a sort of strategy to manage them. And when you come to the low power, high importance or interest, we need to keep these ones informed. So they can't necessarily influence the decision, but what happens could potentially affect them. So that's the end of this first video for the 2023 syllabus for Level 4 Module 1. Thank you very much for watching and more to follow.